Well, I think there's been a lot of interesting presentations this morning, and you'll be pleased to know there's just one more before lunch. And just before I go into the presentation, to introduce myself, my name's Imogen Swain. I'm a senior manager here at RGL Forensics in the London office, and I'm a qualified accountant, and I focus on forensic accounting, and predominantly a lot of the work happens in the property and energy markets and on business interruption losses. So today the presentation I'm going to go through is really more from the policyholder side and the work that we in the insurance industry will have to do to help make sure that the claims process is run, I think, as has been said, as smoothly as possible, given the unknowns, the known unknowns and the unknown knowns that we've been talking about earlier. So just to, before we start, it's very high level. I think we've talked a lot today about the fact that nothing is certain in what anybody is saying. So we're using research that has been taken from a number of industry and government articles that we've seen. We're talking about businesses in this presentation rather than individuals, and obviously just the comments that will come up, some of which are quite strong. They are of the research and not necessarily RGL's or myself. So just to look at it in a different way in terms of what is Brexit, not as in us leaving or the UK citizens leaving the EU, but what does it actually represent? It represents complexity. I think there's been a lot of talk about how much this will impact each part of our lives and each part of business, and every industry to a certain extent is going to be impacted. It's divisive. We've talked again, if we ran the referendum again today, would we have a different result? So yes, there was a majority, but everybody has their own opinion, and quite often they're polar opposite opinions. So trying to get anything in a negotiated manner can also be quite difficult. I'm sure that we've all had discussions with family and friends, and unlikely to be everybody of the same view. So it has led to a lot more engagement in trying to think about what is best for the UK and Europe. I would say it's also a global impact. We've talked about, and we're all sitting here in the UK, but it is a global impact, which was highlighted by the fact that on the day of Brexit, it was featured in a number of newspapers and reported globally. So obviously, primarily the UK, the EU, but there's also some impacts beyond the EU. It represents change, and I think that's where we have an inherent fear of change, and so we like to try and work out what the change will be and what the change will mean, which is why there's probably so much of everybody thinking that they know what this means and they know what they want. So I think that's why we have so much commentary, both from businesses where it's actually going to impact, and commentators who want to speculate as to what this will all mean. And we're all working in the insurance industry, which is inherently an industry about risk and how best to manage risk, and looking at taking on policyholders, what risk considerations should happen. And as we've been spoken about in terms of risk consulting, risk engineering, you can learn a lot about an insured, how their business operates, what could happen, a fire, a flood, but this just adds another layer of uncertainty, and that is not something that any business typically likes, and the insurance industry is no different. So what are we looking at already, and what considerations are we as accountants thinking about the impact of Brexit on claims? Well, the way we look at it is effectively, when we're looking at business interruption cover, what we're trying to look at is the losses flowing from an insured incident and from physical damage. So Brexit, in that way, is something that actually needs to be stripped out from the cause and effect principle, because we're not in a position to be paying for the impact of Brexit, solely the impact of the incident. But to be able to strip it out, we also need to know what that impact is, and that's why Brexit will still have an impact on claims and claims handling. So, considerations we typically look at are the economic environment, competition, supply and demand, regulations, seasonality, and policy, and any other considerations. And I'm not going to talk about each of the ones that we've put here, but I see it that there are also, can be broken down at the moment into short-term, medium-term, and longer-term issues. So in the short term, and I think was mentioned earlier, the one thing we know at the moment is that the exchange rate has changed. So exchange rate has been a short-term issue even before Brexit's happened. And we just have, being accountants, we have a nice graph to show the impact of the UK to euro, or pound to euro exchange rate on the date of the Brexit vote, and how that's fluctuated around since that date. I've put on here just to give a kind of opposite opinion, and also to talk about something that was passed on, is that the FTSE, despite the Brexit vote, the FTSE has actually increased since Brexit. So it shows that in a much more global presence, there had still been confidence in the market. Obviously, the last week or so has seen a little bit of a change in that, but that is a highlight again of a separate global impact, a separate market factor that has influenced, and that, as you say, life is not solely about Brexit. So if we go back, so that was the short term. In the medium term, when Brexit happens, the trade and the trade tariffs and any barriers, I think that seems to be one of the really key components of how we will actually trade and how the policyholders will continue to trade. And then in the longer term, what we can look at is, yes, there's going to be some incorporation of EU law, but are we going to then review these laws and say, actually, which ones work best for the UK? So will there be some repeal of EU law? There's also some talk that maybe the accounting rules will change, because at the moment, UK businesses are focused on being in IFRS, and there is a specific set of rules for the EU IFRS. Will this change, and therefore how companies report will also change? So there's lots to consider in both the short, the medium, and the long term. And now I'm just going to go through some specific examples in different industries, just to give some idea of what each industry seems to be suggesting are their key concerns. And the first is the automotive industry, and I think there was some mention earlier in the presentation that the UK automotive industry is meeting with government today, and I think that this is purely going to be focused on the issue of the supply chain, because this seems to be very key to the automotive industry. So currently within the EU, with the free trade, there's no custom delays, and there's no import and export tariffs. However, if we had the import and export tariffs, then the estimate is that this would cost 2.7 billion in terms of import cost and 1.8 billion in terms of export cost. So that's a huge amount of cost going to that industry. And interestingly, even if we had the same free trade agreement that is currently in existence, there is a factor that to achieve that, local content needs to be at least 60%. And currently, local content is considered to be within the EU. Obviously, if we're outside of the EU, but trying to work to the same agreement, that would mean that 60% of the content would have to be from the UK, and therefore we may not still even qualify for those free trade agreements anyway, and then you still end up having import and export tariffs potentially. So there's a lot to be considered and a lot of work to be done on that side. And then if we don't look at the financial, but look at the barriers to trade in terms of customs delays, one of the key components and key benefits of the automotive industry is the way that they make their supply chain work. So their focus is not to have large warehouses of parts in various locations. They want to get a smooth supply chain so that as soon as a part arrives on site, it's being processed within a couple of hours. And so with Honda, they oversee over 2 million parts in the UK, and they only keep hours worth of parts on the production line. So if you can imagine any custom delays, that could easily lead to production short stoppages or reducing production rates to avoid outages, which could have a big impact if we're looking at a claim and how we calculate what their production level would have been. So I think that is a really key part, and there's probably a lot of the discussions that the automotive industry will have with government and how we overcome that. Also on the export side, companies such as Aston Martin, they're not so worried about the supply chain and getting that as efficient as possible, but what they're concerned about is not having their money effectively stuck in customs. So if their exports take days to hours or days to leave the country, that's cash flow that's tied up in their business. And if that cash flow is tied up in their business, that's going to affect their growth and their ability to develop. So it seems that it's going to impact all parts of the automotive market. And then there's also things that I, as an accountant, don't always think about, that new models need approval, and those approvals will need to be done by certain regulations, and the vehicle certification agency that the UK has, will this be acceptable to the EU, or is there going to be further delays in being able to get new models produced in the UK into the market? On a positive note, or potentially a positive note, there seems to be some recognition of this investment risk, and the government is looking at potential ways to support the industry. I think it feels like there's been more reporting on this, and I know in January there was an initial agreement made on the automotive industry to put some more joint investment with companies to really try and promote UK automotive industry. But whether that is actually going to have a material impact is not yet known, because ultimately this is a global competitive market. And so if they're operating on small margins and there are other countries that offer effectively similar product, but without all of the issues set out here in terms of supply, why would they not necessarily move to those countries? So I think that's the real balance of the risk, is how can we manage it? And this will really be determined by how the trade and the tariffs are set up. In each of these scenarios, I have tried to find some kind of positive as to what Brexit will have. I struggled on the pharmaceutical side. It's a highly regulated industry, as it must be because of the nature of the products. But this, and I don't know if you can read it, this little extract here, I think really highlights the cliff edge scenario that people are talking about. In that if a product that was from the UK was sent to an EU country and arrived before the 29th of March 2019, it could go on sale and continue to be on sale after the 29th of March. But if it arrived a day later, the approval would be lost, and therefore we would not be able to sell those products. So that just really highlights that potentially it's even having, it's not necessarily a future effect, even products that are currently approved could still have problems after Brexit happens. So there's been a lot of good work in terms of sharing the regulatory framework to ease these barriers whilst we've been within the EU, and it's really trying to understand how this is going to work after we leave the EU. I think there was a lot of hope that the European Medicines Agency, which is currently located in London, would stay in London, but I think the EU in January announced that they were going to move that to Amsterdam, which kind of really started the process of kind of setting aside that the UK may not be part of this EMA in the EU's heads. So the benefit of being in the part of the EMA is that any products approved by the EMA are automatically granted access to the UK market. And also, approval by the EMA also gives you access to other markets, such as Turkey, who have an agreement that they will automatically approve any EMA products. So it's not just EU markets that the UK could have being affected, it's also non-EU markets. And I read a report saying that effectively, when you look at all the models of the Norways, of the Switzerlands, it looks like unless we are part of the European Economic Community or area, the UK would no longer be subject to gaining the approval via the EMA system. And therefore, we would need to find another way of getting our products approved, and that could lead to potentially slower authorization of products going into market, which could cause some real impact on the pharmaceutical industry in the UK. Also, part of the kind of sharing, there's been a lot of research and development that has been EU-wide, that we all know is a big part of the pharmaceutical industry, and is the way that we keep innovating and gaining new products to help us in our daily lives. And so after we leave the EU, can that continue, or are we on our own doing our research and development whilst the rest of the EU can still work collaboratively? Currently, the UK is also a good location for clinical trials, another kind of revenue source, and also shows that we're kind of at the top of this market. But if we're outside the EU, is the UK still going to be that best location, or will that also start to transfer to other countries? And finally, again, as has been spoken about, this labour force issue. A lot of skilled workforce from the EU countries work in the pharmaceutical industry in the UK, and how will that continue, and how will we get that kind of new talent coming through? Do we have that qualification in the UK to keep us at the top of our game? And finally, and I think again this is not, it kind of goes to this whole passporting issue. There's historically been a lot of non-EU countries setting up bases in the UK as the stepping stone to Europe. And I think that is part of this wider issue that we've been speaking about earlier, as how that will happen, or will there also be similar need to move that European hub outside of the UK. Another industry that we see quite a lot and has another different type of impact is the telecommunications industry. Here we've got a lot of companies that are kind of pan-European, so we've got Telefonica, which runs O2 in the UK, and companies like Vodafone, which has got a European presence, and this will continue after Brexit happens. So they've got to manage this process. Now, we've all been quite happy to see the costs of roaming across the EU fall over the last few years, to the point where now I think it's virtually nothing. It's just used out of your normal data plan. If we go outside the EU, will that continue? And again, I think we need to consider that as both a two-way thing, both UK citizens in the EU countries and EU citizens coming into the UK. How is that going to be managed? Because if we go back to the original costs that we used to have, that can have just some natural barriers that just don't necessarily need to be there. I know when there was a lot of campaigning, a lot of the telecoms companies were trying to say, no, roaming charges are gone, they're not coming back. But I think some of their reporting has kind of relented on the fact that they are, to a certain extent, dictated by the regulators as to what they can do and what they should charge in these cases. Again, there's been discussion about that, oh, we'll have greater independence, we'll have greater opportunity to do what we want in terms of defining our own rules. And so therefore, we won't have to follow the EU's telecoms rules anymore. But I think a good point has been made that this is only going to be the case if, under the wider trade deals and trade agreements that are made, we are not bound by the EU regulations. So in some ways, there is the potential that we may have to abide by the EU telecoms rules, but we won't have any influence into what they are. And up until now, the UK has been a very big advocate in removing unnecessary regulations within the telecoms industry, and that has worked well. But if we're not there, who is going to do that advocacy on our behalf? And also data protection. This is a market which is going to have, it has huge amounts of personal data, because we all have, virtually all have a mobile phone. They're global companies. They've got companies that have got EU citizens, non-EU citizens. The data is ultimately going to be sitting somewhere. For data to come outside of the EEA, we need to have a data adequacy status. That's not something the UK has at this time, on the basis that we're currently within the EU. So it's another layer of bureaucracy, one might say, that we have to go through to get that status. And could that have any implications possibly on location of data centres? Are people going to want to have it within the EU or the EEA to try and kind of minimise the impact of this? And I think overlying this, as we've got this GDPR coming in, again, I think just to reiterate, because of the way that these companies operate, they are still going to have to fall under the GDPR regulations. So potentially, in terms of telecoms, whilst there may be the opportunity for this greater independence, and we are going to be able to define our own decisions on mergers and how our networks are performing, there is also on the other side the potential that we've effectively got something which is going to cost us more, and we haven't got the ability to regulate or have influence on how the network is regulated. The final one that I was going to go through is processed food and drink, and this was another one that has been highlighted by the government as a key area where they've invited companies to set out their vision of what they want and what their concerns are in terms of Brexit. And I don't know if anybody has been to the West Country or knows the West Country, but the photo here is from a set of stalls referred to as Trago Mills, who, shall we say, have not been pro-European for a number of years. I was at university about 20 years ago down in the West Country, and I remember some of these signs. So you drive in and these signs are up there. So certain companies do have a pro-Brexit side and feel that we don't need to rely on the EU. But this industry has a huge reliance on the EU, both in terms of exports, with 60% of beers being exported to the EU, which is 3 times larger than the next largest market. Again, not necessarily the skilled side of the staff, but the unskilled staff that is equally as important as the skilled staff. And I think unskilled is a little bit derogatory, but you know what we're talking about. Huge numbers from the EU in that industry. So there is a huge reliance, and any tariff barriers that come in will also see an increase in the cost of imports from the EU, because we are a net importer from the EU. So it does mean that we need to, again, to look at what will be the implications. And financially, there's the tariff barriers, but there's also the non-tariff barriers. Perishable goods, they need to get through quickly, otherwise in their name they're going to perish. And labelling, may be different standards between the UK and the EU. And interestingly, this brought up another example of the issues and effectively the different relationship between UK and Ireland. Ferrero UK currently make products that they sell and distribute with the UK and Ireland in identical packaging. If we have different food laws, if we have different labelling regulations, that effectively means they have to make two products, which just causes these inefficiencies in production that they've been trying to remove to maximise profitability. As well as any tariff barriers, again, the one thing we know is the exchange rate. The pound has weakened. So food and drink is already costing us a lot more than it used to in the UK. But in the longer term, there is the opportunity to reform EU laws and have a look and say, do they work for Britain? And also look at taxation opportunities to try and maximise profitability and work out what is best for Britain in the long term. So that opportunity seems to be at least a little bit of glimmer of hope in the future. And is this an area where we can gain opportunities from new markets, both in imports and exports? And one area, one factor that we had in an earlier slide was seasonality. And I think it would be interesting to see if certain businesses that make a seasonal product can then work both within the Northern Hemisphere markets and the Southern Hemisphere markets. That could give an opportunity that they have more of an all year round product that they can sell rather than just a seasonal. So there may be some benefits there. So that talks about the high level of just taking a little dip into certain industries. However, this assumes that the impact on each business within an industry is going to be the same, and that's certainly not going to be the case. And an example that came up in part of the research was the sugar industry, where you have Tate & Lyle on one side and British Sugar, which sells under the Silver Spoon brand, on the other side. So if we ask the question, will Brexit be good or bad? Well, Tate & Lyle was an advocate for leave. They make their sugar from sugarcane. Sugarcane is predominantly grown outside the EU, and therefore they have been subject to extremely high tariffs to import their raw material, up close to 100% for some countries. And they feel that this discriminates against sugarcane producers, as sugar beet can be grown, the alternative raw material can be grown within the EU. There have been protectionist sugar policies, which I believe is part of this common agricultural policy, which I recall even from school, everybody moaning at that, telling us all about that. So that's been an issue for a while, and how does that benefit or make the UK economy suffer? So for them, they feel that's had a big influence, and they've downsized their sugar refinery in East London by around 50% since 2009, which in their material they seem to say is virtually all due to the fact that the EU has these tariffs. I'm not saying that is the case, I haven't seen their accounts, but they're saying it's certainly a factor. So they feel that by leaving the EU, we're going to be in a level playing field, or they'll be in a level playing field, and this increased competition will help deliver more innovative products. So you've got one of the big players, it's all going to be beautiful, it's all going to be great. You then have British Sugar on the other side. Let's say they make their sugar from sugar beet. Sugar beet is grown in the east of England and works well as a rotational crop with wheat, so there are other benefits to growing the sugar beet. They have benefited from this protectionist agricultural policy, and now the National Farmers Union, which would be working in line with them for this, they're now concerned that we're going to be importing sugarcane at a relatively low price due to the fact that it's going to be dumped from at below production cost from countries such as Brazil and Thailand. And in their world, if we have low or zero imports, then this would lead to job losses from the British Sugar side. So whether we get an increase in the utilisation of the refinery in East London, but we have job losses from for British sugar workers. So that it just highlights that both sides can kind of draw an argument. And we've spoken about him a few times today, but somebody who worked for Tate & Lyle for 17 years, Lady Davis. So you start to see at least where his thoughts were coming from, and why he was so adamantly Brexit, having worked with a company that is necessarily not best pleased with the EU. So that's looking at the industry and how claims might be impacted in terms of what issues we need to strip out when we're looking at quantum. But declarations are being made now, and we also need to consider when a policyholder, an insured, is making the declaration, what could change as a result of the Brexit situation. So just things like what currency, and I'm not talking about whether it's legal, illegal to make any of these payments, just talking from a practical side. What currency is the settlement going to be paid in? Are there exchange rate conversions required? Because again, if we know the UK, the pound to euro rate has changed, will there be any other exchange rates which could impact whether a settlement could increase or decrease? In terms of property damage, if we're looking at a UK company, do you need to import replacement products or replacement equipment? If you do, could that cost more money as a result of the weakening pound? Will there be delays due to customs in obtaining replacement equipment that actually could then also impact on the business interruption, because it might extend any period of outage? So that might also need to be considered. We've talked about the labelling of stock. Can you do a like-for-like replacement? And will there be stock obsolescence if there are products which are no longer licensed or for sale to companies? So are you going to have stock which is in your warehouse that you can no longer sell? For the business interruption, you're going to have to try and project forward, and currently you're trying to project forward with no Brexit deal done, not really proposed, and certainly not agreed. So how do you project that forward? History of how the business may be impacted may not be representative, because we're going into a different climate. And will there be an increased risk of underinsurance, be it because replacement costs will be increased, or people may take a too pessimistic view of what's going to happen in Brexit, or conversely, other countries, if you're looking at policy in the EU, will the insured not necessarily know that they may get some benefit from the fact that the UK economy is kind of separate? So I think there's going to be lots of issues with declarations, and those issues are already starting now, because if we take a policy that incepted on the 1st of January this year, they will have had their 12 months historic results, probably use those to try and project forward what are we going to be doing in the next 12 months, because your policy period is 12 months. But if the loss happened on the last day of that policy period, you're then going to be moving forward into 2019, close to 2020, and we've got the date, 29th of March 2019. So even though declarations are being made now, they could, in theory, have an impact when you're trying to consider a claim against a declaration if it went into the period after the EU, after UK has left the EU or is in a transitional period. So in this case, is there any ability to revisit declarations given the uncertainties and the fact that nobody knows what's going to happen? Nobody knows whether there is going to be a cliff edge, hard Brexit, transition deal, nothing much changes. And is there going to be a part where we're all in this together? But that's just a question. So in summary, Brexit was a UK decision, but will have a global effect. There's going to be change in the short term, medium term, and the long term. It's all very hypothetical at the moment because we haven't got a deal. But so that means I think as an industry, we all need to be working with insureds to understand their business, particularly highlighting that we need to look at their business because the industry impact may differ to an individual company's impact of Brexit due to a number of reasons, such as sourcing of raw materials. And we also need to make sure we're considering other market factors. We can't let ourselves just it's all about Brexit. There are other market factors which will also be impacting businesses. It seems, when we look at all the different types of industries, that the cost and the ease of transferring data and goods between the UK and the EU is a common theme, and I think this just goes to probably what we've been saying, that we just need to know how we're going to trade and how businesses will be able to work together after Brexit. Historic performance is not necessarily going to be representative because of the amount of change and the way that we will operate, and therefore there is currently going to be difficulty in making policy declarations, and particularly considering that some policy declarations made now could already have impact on the period after Brexit happens. That's it.